All right, class, let us discuss Buddhism, a general overview. So what is Buddhism? Well, Buddhism, as we mentioned in our previous lecture, is a religion originating in India in the 5th century BCE, founded by Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, which teaches that the goal of life is to achieve enlightenment, nirvana, and parinirvana. And there are two major types of Buddhism, which we will talk more about later. Theravada Buddhism, which is the most ancient school of Buddhism, popular in India, Sri Lanka, and Southeast Asia. And Mahayana Buddhism, which is a later Buddhist school popular in China, Korea, and Japan. Now, there are two different types of major Buddhist texts that exist in this tradition. The foundational scripture is referred to as the Tripitaka, or Three Baskets, also known as the Pali Canon. And this is Buddhism's most ancient collection of scripture, containing accounts of the life and teachings of Buddha and his disciples, as well as rules concerning the religious community. And the second major type of Buddhist sacred text, we're just going to call Mahayana Sutras, which are later Buddhist texts of the Mahayana tradition. One example of a Mahayana Sutra is the Lotus Sutra, which is a rather famous Buddhist text that contains extensive discussion of the concepts of compassion and skillful means. And it contains the famous parable of the burning house, which we are going to read later on. So with this in mind, let's review three major Buddhist teachings that we're going to touch upon throughout the week. Now, before we move on, let me say something that is immensely important. To grasp the teachings of Buddha, one must have an understanding of the life of Buddha because they are ultimately tied together. So once you finish this presentation, make sure that you understand the life of Buddha before you continue on to the next lectures. So with this in mind, what is the first major teaching of Buddhism? The first major teaching is the following, is that the ultimate goal of human life is to achieve enlightenment, nirvana, and parinirvana through the studying of the teachings of Buddha or Dharma, living a holy life, and practicing right meditation techniques. So what is enlightenment, nirvana, and parinirvana? So a general definition of enlightenment is it is a state in which one attains a complete understanding of the nature of the world and oneself. Nirvana refers to an absolute state of mental calm where the mind is untroubled by thoughts of anger, frustration, and sadness. And in Pali Sanskrit, the term nirvana literally means to blow like a calm wind. And lastly, the third goal of Buddhism is to achieve parinirvana, which is the release or the final release of the mind or consciousness from samsara. And parinirvana, again in Pali Sanskrit, means final peace, which means to never be born again in samsara. So essentially parinirvana is kind of like the Buddhist equivalent of the Hindu moksha. However, unlike Hinduism, Buddha argued against the existence of Atman and Brahman. That is, for Buddha, there is no creator God, and sentient beings are without a soul or ego. And we will learn more about this in another lecture. The second major Buddhist teaching is what we call the Four Noble Truths. And these are basically four major points about the human condition and the nature of the world. The first noble truth is life is suffering, or the concept of dukkha. Second is that the cause of suffering is attachment, or tanha. That the solution to suffering is non-attachment, or araga. And that the path of non-attachment is the middle path, also known as the Noble Eightfold Path. And again, we will learn more about these in another lecture. And the last major Buddhist teaching for us to be aware of this week is this idea that Buddhists should dedicate their lives to what is called the Sangha, or the religious community of monks, nuns, and lay people. And one way that Buddhists commit themselves to the Sangha is by following what are called the 5 basic precepts of Buddhism. which is to abstain from the killing of living beings, to abstain from stealing, to abstain from sexual misconduct, to abstain from false speech, and to abstain from taking intoxicating substances. Now, the foundational teachings of Buddha are found in the first sermon, which is contained in the Tripitaka. So to grasp the Buddhist worldview, one must understand Buddhist teachings in the first sermon. And to do this, please go to the lecture on the first sermon.